Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Our guest is Dr. Paul Poast, a professor at the University of Chicago and expert on international security and alliance politics. We'll unpack how modern diplomacy and military alliances shape global affairs. We'll also have a very deep dive into the impacts of global trade. Paul, thanks for joining us.
I wanted to just launch in and, ask about a book that I read in college, The Economics of War, which, I think lays out some really important dynamics surrounding how states think about whether to start wars and how long they go on. And, I've made no secret that, I'm a proponent of President Trump's trade policy, and I believe very deeply in, kind of what I refer to as supply chains as statecraft. And just speaking yesterday at the National Conservatism conference, I was trying to raise for the panel that I was on the prospect that, having a military industrial base in and of itself and having the inputs required to sustain that's actually a kind of deterrence in and of itself, right? Beyond the threats or the elocution, what we say about what America might do, that the mere presence of those things are there. So, would you say that there's an element to that is sort of under the waves in the debate, or what do you think?
Absolutely. So, yes, I think that first and foremost, when it comes to warfighting, an argument I've long made is that you cannot separate the war machine from the economic machine, if you will. That they do go hand in hand, and I think that this is, to me, it always goes back to the phrase. I can't remember who it was, but he was a U.S. general, said in the 1980s, which is that amateurs think about tactics, but professionals think about logistics, right? And of course, in that case, he's referring to the logistics of actually carrying out an operation. Okay, where are our refueling tankers going to be, et cetera, et cetera. But logistics boils all the way down to the economic side of things. And you cannot have a military that is capable of carrying out power projection abroad. You can't have a military that's capable, obviously, of fighting a large-scale sustained war unless your economy has the phrase I like to use, wherewithal, to be able to support that. And we're seeing that in the case of, say, Russia fighting in the war in Ukraine, that a big part of the reason why Russia has been able to continue to sustain this fighting for so long is because, despite the economic sanctions that have been put on Russia, they have taken other measures to ensure that their economy can survive and in some respects thrive despite fighting this war, whether that is turning more towards China, allowing India and China to be able to purchase oil at a discounted rate, that is, or discounted price. Those are things that have allowed their war economy to continue. And that is a tried and true measure of, again, war fighting going back a long time. It's absolutely been the case for the United States, especially because the U.S. has, until after World War II, typically relied on the fact that we could quickly convert our economy, if need to, into a war-fighting economy. Now, with the nature of warfare today, and especially with the needs for being able to react quickly, you can't just rely on the old adage of, we'll convert our plowshares into swords when need be. You have to already have the capacity to build swords now. And then that is where then the defense industrial base comes in. And it is absolutely the case that really going back to the end of the Cold War, the defense industrial base was kind of allowed to gradually decline for all sorts of measures, whether you called it the peace dividend after the Cold War, which coupled with not just reduced military spending, but also with base closures. But all of these things have, that has fed into it. I think another thing that fed into it was kind of this notion that, also very much evident during the 1990s was that, well, we're moving away from a world where war is even a policy option, which seems kind of silly, but this is a real claim that it was like, well, there's going to be the spread of democracy, the liberal international order, peace. China is eventually going to become part of the Western order, right? All we have to do is trade with China. They're going to become part of this. And so And then, indeed, Russia itself is no longer going to be a threat. They're being brought into the G7, now the G8. And so there was very much this heady time in the late 90s into the early 2000s of the world that existed when the U.S. did need to have a large defense industrial base and did have to have high levels of military spending. That world doesn't exist anymore. I think what has happened over the past decade plus, is those ideas that were evident in the late 90s and early 2000s have been shown to be gravely mistaken. That the world is indeed still a world in which military power matters, and that as we've moved more into what you could call a multipolar world and away from the unipolar moment, that has become more and more evident. And as a result, it's become more clear that you do have to maintain that defense industrial base that was there but was allowed to decline. So yes, I would fully agree with that idea that you shared.
Very nice. Nathan, I have a follow-up, but I don't want to impede. I mean, I would
No, go ahead.
just ask, if we agree with that kind of general proposition. I mean, there are all these folks who I think agree with military-industrial rebirth in some abstract sense, but they are sort of unable to conceptualize what the intermediate steps would be, or they want to critique the concept that you could project what military power is going to look like in 10 years. And so, sort of analogies that I offered, when I was in government, were the concept of kind of Britain's shadow factory plan, where you try to create, kind of military dual use, partial scheduled periods where factories try to integrate. Some people rolled their eyes at this and said, no, technology is too advanced to do that now. But the other thing I tried to put out there is that, if you read the sort of wonderful classic strategic studies literature on supplying armies, if you go through Van Creveld and you just control F and you take supply line and you put in supply chain, you have an interesting dynamic here where perhaps if we align supply chains with what we imagine would be supply lines, that is an incremental movement towards a more effective industrial. Am I missing the point here? Are there more effective interstitial steps that we should be taking, or?
So I think overall, I like this idea of replacing supply lines with supply chains, because ultimately the supply chain feeds into the supply line. And, this is, I think one thing to keep in mind is this has long been a concern of states, is that if they go to war, can we afford to continue to trade with the enemy, if you will? And what's interesting is actually one of my former PhD students, she just published a book called Trade at War, Maria Grinberg, and she writes about how during World War I, that's one of her key cases, what was interesting enough was you go into World War I, and there was a lot of this interconnectedness of, if you will, supply chains. That, for example, machine guns themselves could be acquired by Germany from Britain, or the carriages for carrying these were traded back and forth. And what was interesting was that at the beginning part of the war, there weren't actually restrictions on allowing the continuation of this type of trade, even though these were the weapons that the sides were using against each other. Now, as the war carried on, more and more of these things started to get restricted. And then eventually you have the British blockade against Central Powers, and these things start to get cut off. But that was always something that was interesting, was the notion of trading with the enemy and being reliant on enemy trade has long been a concern. But what was interesting was the extent to which, even when adversaries would go to war, they wouldn't initially just cut that off. Right. And part of that was because, this might be short term. And if it's short term, maybe we don't want to jeopardize things. And, also you have to get businesses on board with that. It can be hard to kind of shut that down in just a few weeks or a few days. So there's long been this concern, or this recognition, that supply chains feed into supply lines. And again, what's interesting is that even with that recognition, there's always been kind of a little bit of a casual view of, it'll be fine. And in fact, maybe we'll even be able to continue to acquire these, necessary components or weapons from our enemy, even if we start fighting with them. Now, the extent to which that played a role in allowing, say, U.S. supply chains to become more and more integrated with China, I don't know if that was so much the case. I'm not even sure that really thought was given much to it. I think that a lot of the thinking was more along the lines of a broader political strategy, one that I already alluded to, which was the idea that if we can open up trade with China, say when China became a member of the World Trade Organization, or the U.S. granted permanent normal trade relations with China back in 2000, 2001, that the idea is that China will eventually, through that trade, start to have interests, political interests, economic interests that are fully in line with the United States and with the other Western powers. And so China will become more like us. And I think it was Ian Bremmer who very well said, Ian Bremmer, of course, the head of Eurasia Group, I think he very well said, we thought that trading with China would make them more like Americans, and it turned out they still wanted to be Chinese. Right? So, but I think that was kind of this idea that, well, if we just trade and we can integrate, we can offshore, and we can do those things, it's not going to be a security risk because China is eventually going to want to be aligned with us. And again, I think what's become evident is that's not necessarily the case at all.
Do you think that the U.S. underestimated Russia's economic resiliency as the war in Ukraine started?
It's a good question because, I obviously don't have inside knowledge into exactly what the Biden administration was thinking at the beginning of the war in terms of Russia's resiliency, economic resiliency. What I can say is if you just look at the history of how Russia has conducted warfare, and I even said this early on in the war, there's kind of two things that become evident. Number one, warfare or wartime or peacetime, there's always been the case that Russia's economic prowess or economic wherewithal has always been overestimated. Like during the Cold War, the Russian economy was projected to be way larger than what it actually was. Going back prior to World War I, there was always this view that, Russia is this big behemoth, and it's like, well, no, they're an agrarian economy, kind of backwards in many ways. So the Russian economy has never really been at a level that you would think is necessary to sustain Russia as a great power. But yet it's always been projected as being maybe much larger than it is. And that goes back to the 19th century. That's the first thing. The second thing, and very much related to it, is it hasn't really mattered. And the reason why it hasn't really mattered is because, number one, Russia's just geographic position. You don't have to have as much economic wherewithal if to project power, all you have to do is go across your border. If you need to have a bunch of aircraft carriers and bases and things, then yes, you need to have a lot more economic capacity to build that up. But if all you're doing, to be able to carry out operations in Europe, to be able to carry out operations in the Middle East, to be able to carry out operations in East Asia, it's just truly, in all those instances, just fly across your border and come back very quickly within minutes, then you don't need to have the same type of economic wherewithal as you would if you have to project power at further distances. Related to that is that Russia has a long history of being able to tolerate harsh economic conditions brought on by war. And indeed, their whole war-fighting strategy has never really been based on having the latest technology. It's been based on attrition, predicated on the idea that, yes, we might be experiencing economic hardship, but we're willing to tolerate that longer than you are. We're willing to tolerate more losses longer than you are. And what was interesting is that has long been Russia's war-fighting strategy. And I even pointed that out at the beginning of Russia's full invasion of Ukraine. And that is indeed what Russia has been doing. They're like, you know what? We're going to lose more soldiers than Ukraine. But we have more soldiers than Ukraine. We're going to experience economic hardship, but we can tolerate that and we can still survive. And so that has long been Russia's war-fighting strategy. Now, again, I'm not privy, nor have I heard since, kind of whether people in the Biden administration were aware of that or thought about it that way or conceptualized it that way. What I can say, it was very clear, is that the Biden administration took very seriously the idea of trying to coordinate the sanctions on Russia from the beginning. So much so that Joe Biden even called out the Europeans when they weren't fully getting on board at the beginning. So I think there was a recognition that we got to do harm to the Russian war economy through sanctions, but the extent to which they thought that will actually cripple Russia's ability to conduct the war, I'm not sure the extent to which that was factored in.
Is it your estimate or your estimation that Russia had sort of already accounted for these costs with incoming sanctions? And did they see enough economic gain in their invasion to make it worthwhile? And do you think it was the right bet for them today?
What's intriguing about this is, I would be much more likely to have insight into what the Biden administration thought about this than I would, of course, what Putin thought about this, right? We very much a black box in that regard. But what I think is clear is, number one, yes, you could tell there were some steps that were taken by Russia to perhaps protect certain assets, if you will, Putin's assets prior to the fighting. But overall, I think what was more significant, and I should add, probably the biggest thing that Russia did prior to the full invasion was secure support from China, right? That their no limits agreement was signed on the eve of the invasion, right? It was technically signed on the eve of the Beijing Olympics, Winter Olympics that year, but the Beijing Olympics were, it was all timed around the same time. In fact, I think a lot of analysts who I respect and people who study Putin very closely really think that the invasion would have happened in December of 2021 because that's the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's independence, but that Putin delayed it because Xi Jinping asked Putin to delay it so it wouldn't interfere with the Olympics, because if suddenly there's a war, then there'd be all these, people boycotting the games and so forth. They didn't want that to happen. So it's not coincidence that Russia's full invasion happens about a week after the games were over, but right before those games was when China and Russia signed that no limits agreement. And I think that was part of this preparation, that likely what's going to have to happen is because of sanctions by the West, Russia is going to is going to have those resources cut off. And so we're going to have to be able to turn now more towards China. And that agreement kind of set the stage to it. So I think that suggests that indeed Russia was very much aware of that. If we're going to do this, we need to have China's support. Even if they're not going to send us military, they're going to send us economic assistance. And therefore, more than willing to wait on the invasion until the timing's right for China to ensure that support. So I think that does speak to this. But I think there's also a more fundamental factor, which is that at the end of the day, if you are bound and determined to do something, then it doesn't really matter what the economic harm is. And from my perspective, I think in Putin's mind, but I also think from the perspective of many of the foreign policy elites within Russia, they view conquering or controlling or dominating, whichever word you want to use, Ukraine as fundamental to Russia's identity as a great power. Russia can't be a major power on the world stage unless they control Ukraine. That's the view. And Putin has been very open about a couple things. Number one, likening himself to Peter the Great, kind of recreating the Russian Empire. But also, he's on record as saying the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union collapsed when Ukraine first declared its independence. And so that is why they view Ukraine as just instrumental to Russian identity as a great power. And if that's the case, then you're willing to incur all sorts of costs in order to achieve kind of that status gain.
I want to get George, but we've talked a bit and sort of talked around China. How do you think China is positioned both economically and militarily moving forward? Obviously, Xi was with Putin 2 days ago or 3 days ago. What should we expect from them when it comes to sort of maintaining and positioning their economy?
This is another area where, it's kind of interesting. We're talking about, the increasing levels of opacity when it comes to thinking about decision making, right? We talked about, okay, I wasn't in the Biden administration, but I feel pretty comfortable that I could talk to certain people and figure out exactly what the thought process was. And there's been a lot of reporting to be able to know what was happening there. Russia is even more opaque. And then, of course, now we get to China with Xi, and it's like how to really know what's being thought of there. And what is interesting is the extent to which I have seen debate amongst analysts of China, scholars of China, as well as policymakers involved in U.S. policy towards China, debate what is it that China wants? What are they trying to achieve? And the parade that happened this week, their Victory Day parade, I mean, the display of that on the one hand could be viewed as very alarming for someone who thinks that what China wants is to supplant the United States as the leading power in the world, create its own international order. Because you sit there and you go, wow, look, it's him, it's Russia, it's North Korea, it's Iran, it's this axis of upheaval, right, that is referred to. And even to the extent to where President Trump makes reference to that, right? And he even says, I can't even remember what, but he said it in a very sarcastic way on social media that basically good luck for conspiring against us or something. But I mean, even he took note of this, and it's like, wow, okay, they're all lined up in this way of kind of projecting this alternative order, if you will. And that is not a fringe view of what China wants among analysts, among scholars, and definitely within DC circles. And that goes both Republican and Democrat. This is a view of China. There's others who say, no, China has much more of yes, they want to protect their interests. They do what major powers do, but they're much more of a regional power. They're not seeking to supplant the United States. They instead want to consolidate things regionally, and everything they're doing militarily is geared towards that. It's important to keep in mind China has a lot of territorial disputes, both at sea and in land, towards Japan, towards the Philippines, towards Taiwan, towards India. And so it has to equip itself in this way to be able to address those. You may not like that. People may not want military measures to be taken to address territorial disputes. But that's the way to understand China, is that they're really just trying to handle their immediate region. They do not have these global ambitions in the same way. Now, of course, what really makes that difficult, or at least what goes against that, is you say, well, then you look at what China's been doing economically, whether it's say through the Belt and Road Initiative. And you say, well, that looks like China trying to exert more influence beyond just simply consolidating power regionally. That looks like them wanting to have more of a global reach, a hegemonic reach, even though Xi Jinping himself has said, what was the phrase? Hegemony is not in China's DNA, right? Now, of course, I think a lot of China's neighbors would disagree with that. And I think even some current regions of China, you could go to anybody in Tibet and they would say, yeah, I disagree with that. But, the question is, was he referring to hegemony regionally, or was he referring to hegemony globally, right? And again, that's where the debate really boils down to. What has been clear, though, is China has had no qualms in continuing to lend support to Russia in its war. It has been it has reaffirmed its support to Russia, its alliance with Russia. My view is that's a big part of what President Trump was trying to do. President Trump even said that directly in an interview. I think I cited it in one of my most recent columns where, he was being interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and he even said, that's what you got to do. You got to separate those two. But that's not going to happen. I think that they're really locked in together. I think this week very much demonstrated it. And if Russia truly is this country that is bent on recreating its own control over Eastern Europe, its own, say, imperial control, and China is willing to support that and condone that, then that doesn't point to the most benign intention that China has.
So much of what you said, I think, has given us a lot of kind of food for thought. I mean, I would be, interested just to switch back to the political economy sort of question. Would you agree with the proposition that China has sort of built itself into this corner where it's dependent on export, given the emphasis and the previous 5-year plan on low end and low tech production? I mention this because, I spent a great deal of time trying to persuade people that there's an irony here that, as a kind of Marxist abiding regime, they're sort of stuck in Leninist's problem, of imperialism, that if you have this excess capital, you have to find places to send goods. And if the US starts putting up barriers to you sending those goods in a truly global fashion, I mean, the tariff is quite attentive, I would argue, to the major question of transshipment, that you are going to see China, negotiate down its prices in some way. They'll try to mask this, of course. I think there's compelling data out there, but nonetheless, I mention all this because, are we kind of, as a social science community, as a broader public, lacking in a vernacular to understand this problem? Because it seems to me that those out there who are kind of, trained in neoclassical economics continue to beat the drum that the tariff is going to sabotage America's economy before it sabotages China's, if at all. And so I just wonder about that. What do you think on that question?
So I think you hit on a lot of good points there, and I think it's intriguing about how you relate it to this notion of like imperialism and Leninist doctrine and the critique that he makes about capitalism, because a lot of economists have pointed to Chinese overproduction as a big concern and destabilizing concern for the global economy, and so that is indeed where then it's like, well, what do you do with this overcapacity? Well, you export it, right? And so that's a big reason why, when it comes to thinking about U.S. trade policy and specifically thinking about the use of tariffs, when it comes to China specifically, that's something that is actually in many ways like bipartisan in terms of, because what was interesting was the first Trump administration really escalated matters in terms of putting trade restrictions on China and starting a trade war with China. And I remember at the time, it was actually, I was teaching a class here at the university where they had someone from the first Trump administration come in, and he was willing to come and talk to my class. And he even talked about, and he was someone who has served in like multiple administrations, Republican and Democrat. He had served in many. He was in the Department of Defense. And he talked about how like the capacity problems of China, the trade restrictions that China has put on U.S. goods and other goods has been a long-standing problem that needs to be addressed. He said, so I actually don't have a problem with President Trump imposing these restrictions. Well, what's interesting is when Biden became president, pretty much continued it. In fact, if anything, escalated it, right? The semiconductor restrictions and so forth. So it was like that continued, and now Trump coming back in office even escalated it further. So I think in that sense, for me, from my standpoint, it's like, yes, putting these trade restrictions on China is indeed going to cause harm to the U.S. economy because of how much we trade with China. But I think they're predicated, even under the Biden administration, they were predicated on the idea that this is going to be mutually harmful, but it's ultimately going to harm China more than it's going to harm us. And long-term, China's going to have to relent. And again, I can see why someone would disagree with that and say, well, no, we should just be trading because consumers are going to be hurt. But I can see the logic of it. And again, I think that's actually a logic that's a bit more bipartisan than a whole host of other policies. I think where then people go further is they say, but well, then, okay, fine, I understand with China. And I also understand where China's goods can then be re-exported and go to other countries. But it seems like the tariff policy has gone way beyond that, right? It seems to be like we're using tariffs for everything now and trying to rebalance all sorts of things. It also seems to be going against just simply trying to help to onshore or promote more U.S. production, going back to our discussion about the industrial base and wanting to have that. So I think that, from my standpoint, when I view kind of U.S. trade restrictions currently, I can actually understand the rationale for it. I'm not sure, though, that the rationale fully explains the complete extent to which the trade restrictions are being used.
Right. And I really empathize with that. And I spend a lot of time trying to think about how to clarify for people how much of trade is what I call, a darkling plane, that we don't actually know where most goods go in the production of what happens and how many screwdriver jobs there really are of, stuff mostly fabricated in China, sent to a third country to be assembled. And then they get the label, made in that country.
Yeah.
But I mean, I started to do some testing of the, makeup of goods and to ask questions of the laboratories that customs has set up when I was there for 4 months. And I can't disclose what I, found. I haven't found a way to do that, but I was shocked. The amount of the low value goods in the world that seem to come primarily from China and that wear all kinds of masks is really amazing. So how do you deal with this problem that you can't even really get your arms around? I don't know. How do you persuade the public? I don't know, but it's tough. Yeah,
the re-exporting is a big part of it, and again, in that sense, you could understand. But it's like, to me, I'm not sure when trying to discern. And I recently wrote about kind of the rationales underpinning the Trump administration's trade policy, and even pointed out, like, look, I mean, in some ways, this is like not like the kind of concerns about open trade, the global trading system, China shock. These are not, like, if anything, a lot of those concerns were raised earlier in the decade more on like the left than they were on the right, right? People pointing out that trade is hurting workers and we should be redistributing more. And you can go back into the early 2000s to see those kind of concerns being raised. And what's interesting is I think that makes a lot of sense. And that is something that points to having to kind of reshuffle the global trade system. Also, this notion of, if the target is really about trying to counter China and China's production, that also can make a lot of sense for reasons we've talked about. I think there's ways, though, that, number one, there would be ways that if you could just state that really clearly, you could just say, hey, there's re-export problems, so we got to put these kind of restrictions everywhere. But that hasn't been the argument that's been made, at least when a lot of times these things are being, presented to the public and sold. Hence, like, go back to Liberation Day on April 2nd, right? And you've got this whole schedule, and people are like, where in the world are these? Where are these freights coming from, right? What is going on here? And people are really confused, and it's like, it seems to point to that the tariffs are, the purpose of them and the usage of them is going beyond just the need for rebalancing in the way that I think could be more like understandable to folks.
Yeah, and I think that, the trade imbalances, those are in some ways the crudest mechanism to establish, the transshipment nexus, right? Because they demonstrate, as a matter of the goods in the global market, how much, if you buy, really extreme takes of how many of those goods are produced from China, how much of the country is serving as a filter for Chinese commerce into the United States. But I mean, I've been scraping around, and I'm not, trained in economics, but, I've been trying to explain to people, we have this ongoing social science project where we see a sequencing of tariffs and then we see shifting trade flows. And, China was very effective, as JP Morgan noted, in decreasing their direct shipments to the United States by 30%. Vietnam, Thailand, and one more country, it's on the tip of Malaysia, had an increase in aggregate of 34%. Of goods directly flowing to the United States. We could almost see a percentage by percentage shifting of where the goods were traveling in countries that lack the domestic productive capacity. So, I mean, but they're here again. I mean, how do you separate out these underlying variables that I think, people would be concerned about? And then again, you have to have that articulation that is very clear, which we sadly don't have. So,
yeah, exactly.
Anyway.
I want to briefly shift gears, and then I know we're getting up towards our limit on time here for you, but you've written a lot about allies. Is the U.S. able to project itself as a reliable ally right now? I mean, just look at the last 10 years. You had TPP, then it was gone. The Iran deal was signed, then it was gone, then it was back, then it's gone. You had the U.S. trying to ally itself with Israel, then Iran, then Saudi Arabia. Before that, Saudi Arabia, then Saudi Arabia again, then Iran, now Saudi Arabia again. It seems that we do not have enough of a global strategy to actually be able to draw in long-term allies. Am I wrong in that?
So there's a couple things to think about when it comes to the U.S. as an ally. And, this is such an important question because the U.S. alliance network of both formal allies through treaties as well as partners that are not allies through treaties, but nevertheless are security cooperators. It's so instrumental to the U.S.'s position as a global power. It is what allows us to be able to project power. It's what allows us to have access to be able to use our military might. It underpins the global trade system that the U.S. is in. It underpins the dollar status, the status of the dollar as a dominant currency in the world. So it's very important to U.S., if you will, global position, global hegemony. Even if you think the U.S. shouldn't be the leader of the free world, but you like all the goodies that are associated with the U.S. position in the world, then the alliance system matters. Your question, though, is real important for thinking about, well, could other states start to say, well, we question like being part of this network because we can't really rely on the United States. And one thing that I've long pointed out is that there's like two constants when it comes to the U.S. alliance network over the past 80 years since the creation of that alliance network post World War II. The first one is the U.S. complaining about free riding allies. I recently, just last year, published a research paper. We actually went back all the way to Truman, who of course was president when NATO was formed, and just traced out went through all the public speeches, addresses, press conferences of every president since, and pointed out the extent to which they make disparaging remarks towards our Western European NATO allies, Atlantic allies, versus positive remarks. And what you see is there's a lot. It is indeed the case that Trump, especially in his first term, was highly critical. But what was interesting was, as we pointed out, is his language. Yes, he used like sharper language, but the message wasn't all that different from Obama's message. It was just the tone was very different. Obama's was more like, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed. Whereas Trump's was more of an anger, but both of them came across as very much like, you all need to spend more on defense. You all need to do more on defense. It's important to recognize that it was in 2014 that the Wales Pledge was signed. That was the first time that the NATO countries ever promised to go to 2%, let alone now they're promising to go to 5%. But that was under Obama that this was happening. So that's the first constant, is U.S. complaining about free riding allies. That has been like something that has happened throughout. You can say there's a famous remark by Kennedy of like, they're living off the fat of the land, right? Talking about this. Then the other constant is European allies being very concerned about the U.S. just abandoning them. And not even European allies, but just all U.S. allies being like, oh boys, the U.S., can we depend on them? And indeed, this was, partially this was what drove the U.S. to be as committed as it was during Vietnam, was we need to send a signal that we are willing to incur, if we think this is important, we're willing to incur lots of harm and pain in order to be able to conduct this to support an ally. But what's interesting is this notion that countries question the dependability of the United States has, again, been just as constant as the U.S. complaining about these countries being free riders. It's important to remember that Charles de Gaulle took France out of the military apparatus of NATO in the 1960s, largely because of this. He was like, we can't depend on the United States. We need to have our own nuclear weapons, and we should be defending ourselves. Now, interesting enough, they didn't leave NATO, the treaty. They just left the military apparatus and kept everything. But that pointed to this idea. Or going back to, say, the Iraq War, there was lots of, the biggest opponents to it were U.S. allies, and being like, oh, we can't really trust the Bush administration anymore. But what happens? Well, a year after Iraq, suddenly NATO expands again, right? And largely out of support from the Bush administration. So what I think ultimately happens was very well captured by the phrase that Winston Churchill used to describe U.S. foreign policy. And I think this is how most allies view the United States, which is that the U.S. will always do the right thing after exhausting all other options.
there you have it. I mean, I think that's a good, clarification. And I try to remind my friends who were despairing about the Trump administration's foreign policy towards Ukraine for a long time. I mean, now, as someone who studied in the 1990s, what was actually being discussed privately about Ukraine, which I don't think was very nice at all. To see the president, at least talking about the veracity of the threat that would, legitimate an American security guarantee. I'm not saying he's going to give one, but I mean, the frankness with which he is discussing the topic is extraordinary, given what I would say is a kind of duplicity in that question, which has such a long legacy, to the enormous detriment and to the immiseration of the Ukrainian people. So, I mean, again, I'm often alone discussing the merits of President Trump's foreign policy, but anyway, that I certainly take your point, and I think it's a very valid one. So anyway,
I was going to say, I absolutely think that phrase, I've used that phrase to describe kind of how I think Trump will ultimately end up with Ukraine, which is that, he comes in, he's very keen on trying to broker a peace agreement. He wants to try to do that. And back in February, with the Munich Security Conference remarks that Trump administration officials were making, people were like, oh my gosh, Trump's going to, abandon Europe and NATO and all this. And I was like, he's not going to, what he's trying to do is for whatever reason, maybe it's because he wants a Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know. But he really wants to be able to.
He wants to go to heaven, he said.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. So he wants, but he wants to broker a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. Well, the only way that he can do that is if both parties sit there and say, we want to have you in the room to help broker this. And that's not going to happen if Russia sits there and goes, why in the world should we talk to you? You've done nothing nice to us, right? Like, why would we trust you as a mediator? So I've always viewed this as Trump in his own way being like, well, I've got to make Putin think, be willing to come and talk to me. And so I'm going to be friendly to him, and I'm going to be a little bit harsher to Zelensky, and I'm going to be this to kind of show that, no, I'm willing to be balanced here. I'm not all in on Ukraine and so forth. But I think what's happened is, but I think, and that led people to say, oh no, he's turning towards Russia. And I don't think that that's what happened at all. And I think what we've seen since is, indeed, Trump has gradually kind of come to the realization that, okay, I've done what I can to try to bring Russia on board, and I'm not sure it's going to happen. And so maybe it is the case that Russia actually might be the bad guy in this case, right? And I think that he's probably come across to that realization.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we want to be respectful of your time. You've generously given us 40 minutes. For our listeners, where can they follow your work?
So every week I publish a column for World Politics Review. It always comes out every Friday. I post that on my LinkedIn page as well as social media, X and Blue Sky. So, people follow me on those platforms, they'll see it. And so that's probably the main way that they could stay informed of my various views on foreign policy issues.
Thanks again for tuning in to Clearer Than Truth. Special thanks to Dr. Paul Poast for sharing his insights on international relations and security. Find more episodes on our website. See you next time.